Hello and welcome to the Men's Lifeline Academy podcast, where we bring on stellar men who are reclaiming their lives every single day, who are working every single day in their lives to be better, to help improve other people. And today I got Jason Schwartz in the house. Jason is in recovery and he's here to tell us the story. He also loves sports and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, so we'll see if we get a little bit insight into that. So, Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I'm super happy to be here. Super grateful to be here. Looking forward to being able to share my story a little bit and share my path of recovery. And yeah, thank you again for having me.
Course, we always want to bring on men who are overcoming challenges, and one of the biggest challenges someone can overcome is, drugs, alcohol, and everything else. So, Jason, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I grew up in Montreal, Canada. I went away to school to the US for about 4 years to get my undergrad degree. I graduated last year with a degree in engineering, and in the middle of that, I kind of hit a rock bottom with drugs and alcohol and gambling. And I decided to get sober. So I've been sober for a little bit over 21 months now.
Oh,
Along this journey that I've been on, I kind of found out that engineering was not for me. And starting in September, I'm going to be getting a master's of psychology. And the goal really is to help people get from where I was to where I am today. Yeah, we met through X, through a platform that I'm trying to build to kind of share my story a little bit and be authentic and vulnerable and honest and allow other people to kind of see that they're not alone in this fight against alcoholism and drug addiction and recovery. For so long, I felt like I was alone and like no one understood what I was going through until I met someone who really understood what I was going through and had been through it themselves. So that's kind of the whole point in everything that I'm working for is to help other people feel a lot less alone.
well, I think that takes a lot of courage to seek out help and recognizing you were, an addiction. And I'm just glad that you recovered 21 months. Oh, man, way to go. And let's get some cheers in the comments below. 21 months, and whether it's 1 month, 10 months, 1 day, 1 hour, 1 second. It's always important to celebrate recovery and sobriety. So, what kind of led up to that? I know you said in the beginning that you were into engineer and you found out engineer was not for you. Is that where it kind of began? Doing that?
Yeah, so it actually it began early on in my childhood. I from the outside looking in, it looked like I had an amazing childhood. I grew up in a loving family. We were very fortunate, very close. I had two older brothers, two loving parents. We'd go on vacations, a decent amount throughout the year. I was in a private school. I had lots of friends, all that stuff, but on the inside, it didn't feel that way. Um, from when I was really young, I always felt like an outsider. I felt like I didn't fit in. I felt like I didn't belong. Um, yeah, I had two older brothers that were kind of doing the older brother thing and picking on me a little bit, and I didn't know what to do with these emotions that would always come up, and I would always lash out in anger. I didn't know how to manage my emotions. I didn't know how to regulate my emotions when I was younger, and so it would always come out in the form of anger. And I was always looked at like I was this bad kid that was constantly getting mad at people and lashing out on people and throwing tantrums and uncontrollable, all these things. And so I was constantly being punished for it. I would be locked in my room, my iPod taken away from me, like all that stuff, right? And it's so interesting even sharing this because, of course, a lot of people have had horrible trauma-filled childhoods, right? And the way that I'm explaining it, like, oh, I had my iPod taken away, it's very interesting, and that's something that I had to overcome. So when I went to treatment, it's something that I struggled with in sharing. I was with these people who had suffered abuse in their childhood and all this stuff, and here I was like, I had my iPod taken away when I was younger. You know what I mean? And I had to really learn that everyone's traumas are unique to them. And while some people could have much deeper or from the outside look like much more significant trauma, this is what really affected me in my childhood. And being able to come out and share these things is what really helped me get on the other side of it. So instead of, hiding behind the fact that, oh, I'm not as bad as you, or I'm not, I didn't go through things that are as bad as you, or any of that stuff, I really had to come out and recognize that these things had profound effects on me in my childhood, and the only way to be able to overcome them was to work through them. And working through them meant, being vulnerable about it and talking to other people about it, and sharing my story. And um that's how this whole thing kind of happened. To go back to the story, for so long I thought that what I had been going through was normal. I thought having two older brothers, picking on me, and getting in trouble for my anger, I thought all that was normal until it got to a certain point where I was suffering so badly that I talked to someone about it, and they told me that the ways that I was feeling after all this happened was actually what was normal, given the things that I experienced in my childhood, the given the core beliefs that these experiences gave me. And that continued on for a long time until my early teenage years. I felt different. I felt like an outsider in my own family, like I didn't fit in, like I didn't belong, like, my two older brothers and my parents would always get along and have good times and, be loving and all that stuff. And here I was on the outside, unable to fit into that, always ruining vacations, ruining dinners, just feeling like I was the problem child. And that continued for a long time. And so in my early childhood, like elementary school and stuff, I went to school and, almost compensated for that feeling of feeling like an outsider while I was at school. And I was the bully. I was the ringleader. I was the person, I took on my brother's role at school, and was that person at school. And for, grades 1 through 6, it really, it worked. I had a lot of friends. I was the popular kid. I was the kid that people look up to, all that stuff, until, my friends started getting older and started realizing who I really was and what I was really doing. And then just like that, I became the outsider at school also. So not only was I now feeling like an outsider at home, but I was feeling like an outsider at school as well. And, for 2 or 3, this was in 8th grade, I think. So, for like 2 or 3 years in 8th grade and ninth grade, I had no way of dealing with any of this stuff. I had nothing to lean back on, no solutions. I was just miserable, truly miserable, feeling left out all the time, going home after school and crying. And the one person that I confided in the most was my mom. She was someone that I felt like I could talk to about these things. And then out of nowhere, the summer going into 10th grade, my mom suddenly passed away.
Oh my gosh.
She had an allergic reaction, and within hours, she passed away. And just like that, my safe haven confidant, the person that I went and had in my corner, disappeared, just like that. And a few months before that, I was actually introduced to smoking weed. And it's really interesting. The story is really interesting. And I've actually reflected a lot about it over the last, year since my sobriety, of how I even got into that in the first place. And, I can't use the excuse of my mom as the reason that I tried it, because it happened before.
Hmm.
And looking back on it, I was such a people pleaser. I was the kid who always felt left out, who always wanted to be let in. And I found out that my friends were smoking weed and I was left out of this, right? And my whole childhood, I grew up in a family that was very anti-drugs, like not big drinkers, drink on the weekend, all that type of stuff, but never blacking out, never going crazy, never partying, not smoking weed, not doing drugs. And so I always had this negative view on drugs. I was terrified of marijuana,
Oh, sure.
truly terrified. Like I grew up thinking that it was bad. And then my friends who I wanted to so bad to feel a part of started smoking weed. And so I kind of weaseled my way in there. And I remember talking with another friend, not who I was actually close with at the time, not a part of this group. And I was like, I remember telling her how terrified I was of this and how badly I didn't want to do it. But doing it was fitting in. Doing it was feeling a part of. And so, I remember the first time that I did it, that I finally weaseled my way into this friend group to smoke with them. And I don't remember the high that it gave me, but I remember the feeling of being a part that it gave me. I no longer felt like an outsider. I felt like I was being included in this plan. I felt like I fit in. I felt like I was doing what all the cool kids were doing, right? And so that was my first experience with it. And then my mom passed away, and then all these people that had shut me out before kind of let me back in, right? Because here I was, the kid who had lost their mom, the kid who, his whole life kind of just fell apart in front of him. I was no longer the person who was left out of things. I was actually being included in things now. And, to even go one step further, not only was I being included in things, but I kind of was part of the thing. I was the thing. Me and three friends that used to smoke together all the time, we like formed this clique, and we gave our name to ourselves, and I was in 10th grade, and that was what I'd been searching for my whole life. Like truly feeling a part of, and here I was all of a sudden part of this clique that had a name for ourselves and a group chat, and we texted it all the time, and we'd hang out all the time and smoke weed together. And that's how it started. That's how I felt a part of. And then the feelings that the drugs were giving me were superseding that. They were becoming more important than this feeling of being a part. They were taking me out of myself. I was no longer feeling the feelings that came with my mom dying, which, to be honest, it wasn't even really sadness so much, or the grief that we would think, that you would think that someone who just lost their mom would feel. It was a lot of confusion.
Okay.
Here I was, this 15-year-old that had never lost anyone close to them in their whole life. And, you know, all of a sudden, the person closest to me was gone. I didn't know what to feel. I didn't even really know what happened. For so long, I was in a state of shock, um, not understanding how this happened, how am I supposed to feel, what am I supposed to do? And so a lot of confusion came up. And, with that, a lot of anger. The confusion brought about anger because I wanted so badly to understand what was happening, but I didn't. And so the weed and getting high took all that away, right? And then I was introduced to alcohol, and then on the weekends we'd start drinking, and every time I would drink, I'd black out.
Wow.
And that was, I thought that was normal. I thought that's what people did. I thought, what do you mean? Like, I thought that's the whole point. Aren't we drinking not to feel? Isn't that what this whole thing is about? And so, from my very first experience drinking, that's what it was, right? And then it continued, and it got worse. And I started smoking during the week. And then I started, my friends that I joined this clique with weren't smoking as much as me. So I had to go and find other friends that would do it with me.
Well, so
And,
you left
and
that group to find a group that was even more.
yeah. Yeah. So,
Wow.
I left them behind and went and found others. And then I started feeling alone again, right? Because these people that I'd felt a part of, I pushed them away and started feeling alone. And, even with the blacking out and getting drunk on the weekends, that anger that I was talking about, that I was trying to hide with this, would come out when I would get drunk, because I have no control over anything. I didn't even know. I would wake up so many times the next morning, so full of anxiety, not knowing what I'd done the night before. Most of the times, it being, yelling at someone who was one of my closest friends, and then having to explain to them and apologize to them the next day, and, basically say, I don't even know what happened. And then that apology would mean nothing, because the next weekend I'd do it all over again. Right. And this continued and continued. And so that's, I talked about going away to school, and that's when I decided to run away from home. Like, I decided to go away to school. I thought it would solve all my problems, and that's where I learned that wherever I go, I am.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the problems weren't my friends. The problems weren't where I was living. The problem was me and my relationship to substances, and my anger and my unresolved trauma and grief and all that stuff. So when I went away, for the first 6 months, I had the time of my life. All that stuff was kind of put behind me. I met people that were into doing similar things, smoking weed, drinking, and then it caught up with me again because the blacking out and the anger and um, not acting in ways that aligned with my values that I grew up with because, the drugs and alcohol took me so far away from that. When I also when I got to school was the first time I ever experimented with harder drugs.
Jeez.
And I like it would be an understatement to say I loved them like beyond. It did everything for me that the alcohol and weed were doing, but to another level. And I'm thankful that at the time, I took a step back and realized how this was going to end very poorly and stopped doing them. And, I made a commitment to myself. I said, I'm not going to do these harder drugs ever again, really. And for 2 years, it worked. Um, and then I found myself in a codependent relationship that was a very toxic relationship that I, was constantly bringing all of this stuff into all this unresolved trauma, like I just talked about, and then um, it went sideways, and that's when I went back to the harder drugs. And I hear this so often in recovery. I hear this so often from people that, our worst nightmare isn't even the drugs and the alcohol, it's the codependent relationships because once those end, we rely on something to prove our self-worth. Like, oh, I'm good enough because this person's with me, and I find, my emotions are tied with this person, the way that they feel about me and the way that they treat me. And as soon as that goes sideways, here I am left with all of these negative emotions, this lack of self-worth, lack of, self-esteem that I need to do something with. And that's when I went and went back to these harder drugs. And that was the beginning of the end for me. I went 3 months straight doing Xanax every single night, and drinking every single night and
Oh,
snorting the
using Xanax
Xanax.
and
And this was not the way that I grew up, right? Like I said earlier on,
yeah,
like
full opposite.
I was scared of this stuff, right? And here I was doing it to an extreme because it was the solution to my problems. I talked about how in eighth grade and ninth grade, when I was going through that whole thing with my friends, I didn't have a solution. Well, now I did, right? Now I had a solution in drugs and alcohol. And I didn't need anyone else. Like I was isolating during this whole thing. I didn't need anyone. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was good enough because I wasn't feeling anything ever.
Right. I was gonna say the
And
drugs did that for you. The drugs let
yeah,
you know that you were wanted and needed, and that's what's hard about addiction is with the drug becomes everything. It becomes that surrogate partner. It becomes that comfort.
yeah, yeah. And so that summer also like was when everything kind of started to fall apart also. I had a job that I loved in engineering and I really did love it. And one morning I showed up completely drunk out of my mind, falling asleep at my desk, still on the Xanax from the night before, and I got sent home. Um, and I had high hopes to get this was an internship during the summer, and I had high hopes to get an offer back at the end of the summer to be full time the next year after I graduated. And when I didn't get that offer back, I was like, how could this happen? Why did this happen? I was showing up to work every day, doing all the things. Like, I thought they loved me. I thought I was doing my job really well. How could I not get this offer back? And now looking back, well, why would they want to hire someone who shows up to work drunk?
Right.
Period.
Exactly.
Right? That's it. Like, why? And now I could take responsibility for that. Whereas in the past, when it happened, I'd blame them. Like, how could they? What's wrong with them? How do they not see me? Like, look at me. I'm so good. All this stuff. I'm going to make them pay. All that stuff. Right. And looking back, well, no, actually, they probably dodged a bullet because, what was to follow and what came. And yeah, and so, the Xanax was strong. It was a very, very strong drug that, I talked about blacking out and the anger and stuff like that. This was like blacking out to the extreme. And so when I went back to school after that summer, I continued doing it. But that is when I was surrounded by people again, right? People that I felt comfortable with because these were my friends. And one day I blacked out and I went berserk, just crazy on everyone around me, my roommates, all the people that I was closest to. And the day after that, I had so much shame and so much guilt and so much embarrassment that I actually moved out of my apartment. Um, and I remember talking to my therapist at the time, and she was saying, "Are you doing this in a way that is going to allow you to heal, or are you doing this in a way because you want to continue to use the drugs just with no one around to watch you and no one around to see you?" And I was like, "No, no, no, like I'm doing this to heal, this is what's best for me. They're all the problem. I'm not the problem. This is what's best for me." And that day was actually the last day that I ever did Xanax
Really?
because of what had happened. Um, but as you could probably kind of tell already, like my story is a lot of trading one drug for the other, trading one vice for the other. And as soon as I finished with the Xanax, that's when I found Coke. And um, that was truly the beginning of the end. I isolated after that incident, I isolated myself in my new apartment that I lived in alone, never saw any of my friends, rarely saw any of my friends. None of them really reached out to me because, we were in our senior year of college and they were all having a good time, and here I was ruining that good time for everyone else, and I don't have any resentments as to why no one reached out to me. I totally understand why no one wanted to be my friend anymore after 3.5 years of constant turmoil, of constant destruction, of constant drug use, constant lashing out. They had had enough. And I totally understand that. I had had enough of myself. And so I isolated for 6 months, and this was in my last semester of my senior year, and doing coke every day, all day. And up to this point, I was like basically a straight A student. Um, Through all this, I don't know how, and honestly,
That's
I'll get to
impressive. Like
that.
you were a straight A student through
Yeah.
all. I know you don't do it like highly at the weekends. I'm sure you got all the work done during the week, but
Yeah, it was intense, and I'll actually get to that in a second because I kind of missed out on that before, but studying was one of my addictions as well. And it was actually probably my first addiction. So, well, I'll get to that in a second, but basically through my isolation, I was doing coke all day, every day, not getting off my couch, not sleeping for 6 months, trying my best to finish off my last semester, and I failed a class in my last semester. And it was supposed to be the class right before I was supposed to graduate and get a job in engineering. And that's kind of when I was like, okay, whoa, hold on. I went from the straight A student to now failing a class right before I had my dream job. What's happening?
hmm
Right? Something's wrong. And earlier in that semester, I kind of cried out for help to my dad because me and my dad were still very close. I talked to him all the time. I would lash out in anger with him all the time. He was kind of my punching bag for the longest time, and I'm so grateful that he never left my side because I don't know what I would have done without that.
that's an
Um,
incredible dad right there. I mean, really.
yeah, and truly, I mean, that was part of what saved my life was having someone that was there for me unconditionally, knowing that he was always there for me. And it was someone that I constantly tried to push away to make this thought that I had into a reality of that I'm so alone, no one loves me, no one cares about me. But here he was not leaving, unable for me to really make that a reality, right? But I constantly kept trying, pushing him away, yelling at him, lashing out in anger on him, all that stuff, and he wouldn't go anywhere. And he found me help when I continuously cried out for help. I was like, "Oh, I'm doing," and I kept all of my drug use a secret from him until it became to a point where I couldn't handle it anymore. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I'm doing all these drugs, all this stuff, like whatever. And he found me help. And the help came in someone who had been 7 years sober at the time. And he was the first person that I ever met who had been through anything similar to what I had been through. Up to the point where he even lost his mom in the middle of his addiction.
Really?
Um, so me and this guy, like, really, he really understood what I was going through. So all this time I was saying, no one understands, no one could get it, no one's gone through it. Here was this person who showed up in my life that understood everything that I was going through. I remember the first time that I ever talked to him, he laughed at the situation that I was in, and the laugh came in a form of I was there too. I know exactly what you're going through because I was in that exact moment, and in that moment was when I stopped feeling so alone. Earlier that day, I told my dad the exact same thing, and he was horrified by what I'd been going through, and that made me feel like no one understood. And then this person came out and laughed, and I was like, okay, here's, finally someone understands. And the way that he explained it to me was that I could go to rehab and I could deal with my trauma, my unresolved grief, unresolved trauma, all that stuff, and finally move forward with my life. Or I could continue to deal with it for the rest of my life. Right. And up to that point, I always thought rehab was for, criminals or people that, were like on the streets and didn't have an apartment and weren't in school and weren't doing well in school, right? Because up to that point, I was doing
It's
well
a
in school.
misconception.
And so I didn't think that it was for me. I thought I was different. I thought I was terminally unique, that no one could help me and all this stuff. And after he said that, I was like, okay, like that is what I want. I want to get better from this. I want to live my life. And up to that point, I had tons of suicidal ideations, like always wanting to die. And looking back, it's not that I wanted to die, it's actually that I wanted to live, but I didn't know how to live. I didn't know how to live like everyone else was, right? I thought that I was born different. I thought that I didn't have the tools that everyone else had, or something was wrong with me, or whatever it was. When he said that, it kind of changed my whole conception of what treatment was. So I said, once I graduate, then I'll go to treatment. And this was like in February. So I still have 3 months until my graduation. And as time went on, it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And that's when I failed one of my classes. But now here I
Yikes.
was only a month away from graduation. Right. So I kept pushing it and pushing it. And what I did was actually super dangerous looking back. And I'm so lucky and so grateful that I'm still alive through that because my use just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And, you know, I remember as soon as I finished my last exam, I got on a plane and went to treatment. Like it was immediately.
Just like that.
Um,
Good.
and I'm so lucky that I made it there, right? Because a lot of people don't, especially when I pushed it off and pushed it off and pushed it off. But, looking back, I think that if I had went to treatment right when he brought it up to me, I don't know that I would have stayed sober because I think that I needed to go through the things that I went through to fail that class, to really hit my rock bottom, to recognize that I never ever want to go back to that place. And now I understand that if I ever use a drug or drink ever again, it's not going to be long until I'm in that exact place again if it doesn't kill me before that.
Well, it's one incredible story. And I know we're still just getting into it, so just a few points is, whenever we have something that's unresolved, we had to fill that.
Hmm.
Some people fill it with work, some people fill it with a drug. I know you mentioned gambling as well, that all these dopamines that just grab your attention in your brain.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the first one that I touched on a little bit, but I didn't really touch on was the studying.
I was just gonna say that.
And so, yeah, another part of it, my mom really valued school. And I didn't really when before she passed away. And after she passed away, I kind of dedicated my schooling to her as a way of honoring her. And that's what I thought at the time. But really, what it was that was my first form of escapism. That was my first form of I would go to the library for 10 hours a day so that I didn't have to go home to this home that was missing the most important piece of it. And not only that, but that was just filled with so much sadness and grief in the rest of my family. And so I stayed away from that. And by staying away from that and diving into my schoolwork, I didn't have to feel, I didn't have to go home, I didn't have to be a part of this, right? And that was my first form of avoidance. And as I was doing that, I was doing really well in school. And not only was I doing really well in school, but I was getting, um, I was getting praise from everyone around me, like, wow, you just went through the biggest thing ever, but here you are doing well in school. And I was like, wow, you're right, I am, and that was my first form of external validation. And so I kept doing it and kept doing it and kept going. And then it got to a point where, I had no interest in ever being an engineer, but here I was doing really well in school. I was really good at math and really good at physics. And then, my dad was like, well, if you keep doing well in school, then you could go into whatever program you want. And I was like, oh, amazing. I'm going to keep doing well in school and then I'm going to go away to school, as another form of escape.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you said you weren't interested in engineering yet. You were really disappointed in the job that you didn't get, and you love that job. So it's kind of interesting you say you didn't love engineering, and at the same time, it's like, wait, this was like prime. So was that
Yeah, I
like another form of escapism, like convincing yourself you really liked it?
for sure. I
Oh,
was I was just going to say like I was almost brainwashed into thinking that I loved this just because I was good at it. And the truth is I think that I did love it, but I didn't love engineering. I loved the feeling that it brought me. I loved the feeling like everyone looked at me as like the smartest person in the room because here I was, an engineer that was doing really well in school. I had this good job, all this stuff, right? And it's interesting also because like my life started to fall apart when the classes went from not being so much math and physics based to more actually engineering based.
well, interesting. Okay.
So I was super into the math and physics, calculus and intro to physics and all that stuff. I loved those classes. And then when it started getting into like measurements and polymers and all that stuff, I didn't have as much of an interest in it because I wasn't as good at it also. And so that's kind of when my addiction started to get really bad because here I was no longer, you know, focused on school and the addiction of school. So I had to fill that with something else because, like I said, it was a constant trading of one addiction, one drug for another. And I view my studying as a drug. It's the same thing to me.
Well, it's a lot. I mean, you've been through a lot in your whole entire lifetime. Now, were you ever able to reconcile with your brothers who are not
Yes.
doing this to you? And but what was that like to actually let them know, like, hey, when you were being mean to me and it caused me to lash out? And I mean, I know getting upset the iPad or iPod, is that small catalyst of what really was that breaking point, but it was also everything before that as well. All the the picking on, which is tough for siblings.
Yeah, and it's interesting because so after my mom passed away was when we got really close. The four of us, my older brothers and my dad, we got really close and we were really there for each other and all that stuff and all that picking on and bullying went away. And like I said, I never saw it as a problem before because I thought it was just normal. I thought that's my life. Like that's all I know. And so it was like through the process of getting sober that I saw it as a problem and all this stuff. And honestly, I never blamed them for what they did when I was younger. I really didn't ever blame them for that. I don't think that they were doing it on purpose. Actually, I know that they weren't doing it on purpose. I don't think that they knew any better. I never really blamed them. If anything, I had more of a resentment towards my parents for allowing it to happen.
Okay.
And it's really
So
interesting
your mom never
because
resolved this through all your conversations? Your mom never Did your mom ever, like, step in and, like, addressed it, or
yeah, I mean, my parents definitely stepped in and tried to stop it, but then again, like here I was, um, constantly lashing out in anger. So it was no longer about what they were doing, and it was more about what I was doing.
I see, okay.
And so what they were doing was kind of like, an afterthought almost. And at least that's the way it seemed to me. And, another thing that's really interesting is perspective plays such a massive role in all of this because I spoke to my uncle about this since I got sober and sharing my experience and the way that it made me feel. And he was like, no, 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 it didn't happen that way. And I actually believe that it might not have happened the exact way that I saw it, but the way that I saw it and the perspective that I had of it when I was younger was what shaped these core beliefs, is what shaped me as a person, right? And that could be super dangerous because being, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 year old, my perspective isn't necessarily the real perspective of what's going on or the perspective of what my parents had or even my brothers had, right? And there could be such a disconnect there. So how do we bring that connection together to make sure that, younger kids that maybe don't have their full cognition up to a certain point, or don't have their emotional abilities up to a certain point, how do we make sure that they actually understand the reality of what's happening?
No, that's a good question, especially as we know, especially in males, the brain doesn't fully develop to like 24,
Yeah.
25 even. And how do you teach people more of that emotional regulations? I know a lot of schools now are teaching that a lot more now, especially with all the recent events that have happened. They've been on it a lot more.
Hmm.
So, how was it now that you have the skills to handle a lot of that drug addiction now? What's that like? Going like kind of reviewing like not having the skills to begin with and just always lashing out in anger and always like kind of rejecting yourself of everyone has these skills and everyone knows
Hmm.
what's wrong with me versus a skill is something that's learned and taught that you might have more now, especially with being sober for 21 months.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty big question. Like, I don't necessarily know that there's one specific answer to it.
Okay.
I now know better. I know things now that I didn't know before. The guy that I met who actually helped me get sober and I say saved my life, he said this thing to me one time that I loved it. He said that before he got sober, he used to think that 1 + 1 = 3. And when he was in treatment, he realized that 1 + 1 = 2. And once he realized that, he was never able to go back to thinking 1 + 1 = 3.
Really, that's an interesting phenomenon.
And that's where these tools come in of learning more about it and being able to take action and no longer being able to accuse other people and no longer being able to play a victim and really taking responsibility for, the things that happened in my life because no one else was going to do it for me. Right. I so often I was like, well, it's not fair. They did this to me when I was younger and my mom passed away and I didn't do any of this stuff. So why is it fair that I need to deal with any of it? And it's true, it's not entirely fair,
Hmm.
but no one else was going to do it for me. So either I was going to do it or no one was going to do it. And that's how I learned how to take responsibility for my life. And, to kind of answer your question a little bit, like now I know the tools of how to live my life without drugs and alcohol, right? Like drugs and alcohol were the solution for me for so long until they no longer worked. Now I had to learn a new solution, which was emotional regulation and taking responsibility and reaching out for help and action and actually, you know, being the catalyst for change because for so long I wanted a miracle to happen in my life, for something to change, but I wasn't doing anything. And that's when I realized that I actually needed to put in action and do things differently to make something happen. And, one of my favorite sayings is if nothing changes, then nothing changes because it's so simple, but for so long, nothing changed. So nothing changed. It actually continued to get worse. It wasn't until I made a change in my life that things actually started to get better for me.
And so, what's it like now chasing the route to go to be it more of like in psychology to help people who are once in your position? Now, what's been now? Do you have more of a passion for that, or it's more you're like it's we can recognize it's truly a passion versus for the escapism?
Yeah, for sure. So, it kind of started actually a lot earlier, like around when I was probably 16 or 17, right after my mom passed away. I I always had these, I always wanted to write a book or like give a seminar on helping other people who were dealing with what I was dealing with, which was, at that time just losing my mom and being so lost and not being able to see any light at the end of the darkness and really just not knowing how to live. And it's so interesting because at the time I didn't have the solution. So I never thought that it would come to reality.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was in treatment and I started to finally get my own solution to this, I that's all I wanted. And not only that, but seeing the way that the person who saved my life, how he was able to impact me in such a profound way and I mean like the most profound way. right? Like going from someone who wanted to die every day to now being excited about my life. It's not that that was entirely him, but he helped me get there. And it changed my life. And so bringing in that dream of, when I was younger to want to help people and now actually being able to help people, I thought it was perfect. It could not be more perfect. And the more that I work in this world and live in this world of recovery. I worked at a treatment center for the last year, and I was able to share my experience with the people that were going through it. And the more that I work in this and start my platform on X, and I started a blog a few weeks ago, just sharing my story, the more feedback that I get and the more that I recognize that it's truly helping people and not only helping other people, but also helping me. I realize that this is exactly what I want to be doing. Like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be doing the work that is meaningful to me, and it gives me a reason to get up in the morning every day.
Well, that's amazing. Going from having suicide ideations, wanting to die, to now finding a purpose is always at the heart of having a reason to live. They say through a lot of literature to live a life worth living is through work, school, or volunteering.
Hmm.
So doing something active to help somebody, to help yourself, especially with your blogs, your brand on X and how you're celebrating people who recover. I mean, I see you constantly and consistently. If someone's sober for 2 days, shouting them out, 2 years, shouting them out, really being connected in this amazing community of people who have various traumas, difficulties, and who once did recreationally then found themselves in the midst of an addiction and still trying to find a path to living life. And one thing to kind of put a plug in real quick is that if you are feeling suicidal, if you are feeling hopeless, to definitely call 988. It's the National Suicide Hotline number is 9888. And with that, it would be connected to the state that you're in. Now, typically, if I remember correctly, it's the state that you're originally from. So if, let's say you're from Wisconsin and you're like, let's say vacation in New York, I believe it would go to Wisconsin. Don't quote me on that. But still, call the number if you're having suicide ideation. So that way you don't have to struggle alone and get connected to a lot of resources. I mean, with the mental health crisis epidemic, with a lot of suicide ideations on the increase, anxiety is increasing, depression's increasing, drug use is definitely increasing. And the main thing too is the drugs today are not the drugs that were back in the 90s or 2000s. They're different. And so, Jason has an incredible story of that recovery is possible. And that's one of the greatest slogans that's been created over the last, let's say, 5, 10 years, is that recovery is possible.
It really is. And it it really is. And I could also understand because I was there not believing that line, right? Like truly just being like, no, it's not possible. It's not worth it. It's not worth doing any of this stuff because I don't see a way out of this. And the reality is that there is. And I'm living proof of it, and so many other people are as well. And that's what I would say to someone is definitely call that number if you're struggling, and also reach out to someone who had been through it, right? Someone who had come out on the other side of it, because they could tell you what they did. They could point you in the right direction. They could give you the resources. And here's someone that's been through it, right? That could understand truly what you're going through, and you don't need to feel alone anymore.
I think that's a great point too, is and take that time to risk finding somebody, because if nothing changes, nothing changes. So whether you go to NA, AA, Small Recovery, there's a whole list, even websites with like codependency. There's so many resources today that sometimes for people it's overwhelming. So pick one thing that you're going through. And on this platform that we have, we're all about call to actions. We're all about taking action to do something. So if you're struggling with an addiction, if you're struggling with whether it be pornography, whether it be a gambling addiction, coke addiction, drug addiction, any type of drug addiction, let us know below that you don't necessarily need to tell us the drug of choice. Keep that self disclosure, but just put, that I will seek help. So that way, Jason, myself would know that someone out there is seeking help for their drug addiction. Like, I will seek help. When you say will, you're putting drive into it, you're putting action behind the words. You can also say recovery is possible. So let us know really in the below that you're going to seek out some treatment, you're going to seek out some help, and that you're not going to give up in your recovery. I'm sure Jason can tell you that one day at a time is literally one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, 1 second at a time is a very common slogan with people who are going through recovery because it's just that all you have is this precious moment right here. All we have is like right now. We don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. We know what we've done in the past. So let's kind of focus staying in the present where we're focused on what we have control over in this moment right now, especially as we want to lead people to recovery, knowing that it's possible and having that belief in themselves and understanding that there's someone out there who understands what you're going through. Now, we don't know necessarily what happened to anyone's life and what led people to decisions. All we know is that, and believe me when I tell you this, that someone out there knows your story. Someone out there has lived your story. Jason is a living testimony of that he found someone and that got him on the path. So if he no longer felt like 1 + 1 is 3, he came to a realization that 1 + 1 is 2. And he's a math guy. And so, Jason, as we wrap up, what would you like to speak to someone today who's thinking about recovery? What would you like to speak to them today?
I really want to just piggyback off what you just said in saying that someone out there has lived your story and maybe not to the exact degree, every single thing exactly, but there are people out there who understand what you're going through. And, for so long, I felt so alone, like no one could help me, like no one understood. And little did I know there was this massive community of people that all came together and talked about this stuff, right? Like this stuff that I thought no one understood. Yet the whole time there was people, many people, that did understand. And also the idea of community. Like recovery gave me everything that I was looking for in drugs and alcohol. Everything. It gave me a community. It gave me an ability to deal with my emotions. It gave me, the ability to recognize things that were in my control and weren't in my control. It gave me the ability to accept things that were happening in my life, and so much more. And all those things that I just listed were things that I was yearning for in my addiction, but never found until I got sober and put that all aside and really put action into my life and got the help that I needed.
I think it's so beautifully well spoken. You may not necessarily find someone who has lived every little moment of your life, and yet they know the story, they know the themes, they know the look. They know that exhausted, tired look that's on your face. And so let's give a quick shout out to Jason because this was his first podcast. So also below, give him some claps, give him some praise because it takes so much guts. It takes so much boldness and courage to come on a podcast and talk about a struggle. And also at the same time, encourage other people who are struggling beyond belief, who are suffering beyond belief, to also encourage them to seek help. So let's all give Jason a round of applause for being on his first podcast and being 21 months sober, mind you, because that's not easy either.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. And I really appreciate you having me on here and giving me this platform to be able to share my story and be able to help other people. So thank you so much for what you do.
And so that means everyone who's watching this, if you don't know about Jason, all his socials, his blogs, everything he wants me to put on will be in the description below. And he goes first. We always celebrate our guests. So they always go first and we always go last. That's how we give back to people who are taking their time to come on a podcast and share their story. And Jason, when you get your book written, gotta come back on and let us know part 2 about your life and everything you go on, especially as you go to psychology and really try to be a force for good and helping people recover and helping and understanding that you've been there and really focusing on that. And so if you got value out of this podcast, like, subscribe, and share this to someone who is, going to recovery themselves, contemplating recovery, so that they can hear a story of hope, of redemption, of recovery. And also, we also have the Men's Lifeline Academy that meets Monday, 7:30 p.m. EST. That's for men who are ready to transform their lives, who are ready to learn skills and development so that way they can take their life to the next level. If you're interested about that, you can also check it out, DM me, we can have a conversation about that. It is a paid subscription because it's for men who are ready to transform their lives, who are ready to take on the scope of responsibility, accountability. And with that, Jason, thank you for coming on this podcast, my friend.
Thank you very much, Zach. I appreciate it.